Hi, this is not Steve Shives. I'm Supernova. And this is a continuation of my An Atheist Reads How Do We Know the Bible is True, Volume 1, edited by Ken Ham and Brian Hodge. Now, Steve Shives, I think, originally came up with this idea of an atheist reading a Christian book and giving the skeptic's take, the atheist view and rebuttal to all of the points made by the Christians in these books. And I thought it was a great idea, and so I ran with it. And I hope he doesn't mind. And right now in this book, we're on chapter 3. Is the New Testament reliable? This is deja vu all over again. It's so much like the last chapter that I'm not going to say much on it. There's just nothing much to say. It's written by the same author as the last chapter, Brian Edwards, a former pastor and writer of 16 books. And he's going to make a lot of question begging. You'll get tired, not only in this video, but in future videos of hearing begging the question, because they do this a lot. They assume that the Bible's true because it says it's true. In the first section, he makes the same claim that he does in the last section, where he says the Bible is reliable and relevant because millions of Christians believe it. Then he says what the writers believed. And we don't know what the writers believe. All we know is what they claimed to have believed. Paul and Peter both thought that they were giving you God's words from God himself, and that the book was God inspired. And I don't really know where Christians come up with this idea. What do they think that God inspired looks like? For instance, if you talk to two Christians today and you say, is hell a real thing? Some Christians will say, yeah, it's fire and brimstone forever and ever. And some will say, yeah, it's separation from God, and that's it. And they won't come to a consensus, even though you would think that they could just simply ask God what it is. But God doesn't speak out loud. He doesn't speak to crowds. He doesn't speak actual words. If anybody thinks they're hearing from God, it's just a feeling of intuition. So how did gospel writers get actual words? What does this God breathing mean as expressed as exactly what God wanted word for word? I don't think a lot of Christians have put any thought into that. But they seem to think that because the scripture is God breathed, it must be true because they see these as synonyms. And of course, we don't. It goes on to say how their letters were received. Christians believe them, so you should too. Goes on to say that the disciples were telling the truth because Jesus said they were telling the truth. And then it goes on to say that Jesus said that his own words were true. So naturally, you ought to believe them if you fall for the fallacy of begging the question or circular reasoning. There's a question of whether the New Testament is accurate because most of it was passed through oral tradition rather than written, and he counters that. He says that the disciples took down notes immediately. They kept journals. They had their own testaments that they were adding to as they went along, and so they got it down, and then they published it fast. Even though most scholarship believes that the actual disciples were not the writers of the Gospels because these Gospels didn't even come out in their lifetimes, much less show the consistency that would come with eyewitness accounts. He's found a scholar that says that they're all completed before the year AD 70. And I guess if he's found a scholar that backs him up, despite all the scholars that shoot it down, well, I guess we should take this author's word for it. He then goes on to make a very bizarre argument about how the Gospels must be true because they contain things that you wouldn't expect to see if they were untrue. For instance, Jesus of Nazareth was known often and called often Jesus of Nazareth rather than Jesus of Bethlehem. And he makes an argument from ignorance here, saying, well, I don't know any reason why people would make this up. It seems to go against the best wishes of the authors. This isn't what they would write if they were just making up the story wholesale. And I don't think they were making up the story wholesale. I think there probably was a Jesus of Nazareth, and he was called as much because he was from Nazareth. The whole coming from Bethlehem thing was probably made up just to try to fulfill prophecy. And so that's why people would refer to him as Nazarene rather than a Bethlehemite. In the second example, he tells them the story of Jesus visiting the home of Lazarus, and Mary wiping his feet with oil, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil, it says in the Bible. Why does the author even mention the fragrance of the oil? Surely there's no great theological truth to be learned from the statement. My guess is because it's a story, and because even if it's an untrue story, it's still a story, and the author wanted to make it interesting. We have fiction books that go on with flowery language and descriptions that aren't necessary, but it doesn't make them true. So, again, like I say, it's a very bizarre argument. And then his third example is the supposed embarrassment of Jesus, the Son of God and Lord of life, stumbling and falling because he was too weak to carry the cross. Why make up that seemingly despairing cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He calls us an embarrassment. Are Christians embarrassed by the fact that Jesus was beaten and bruised? I don't think so. I think they proclaim it very loudly and proudly. They like the victim narrative. But even though he's asking a rhetorical question here, let me try to give an answer to it. And it's not my answer. It's actually one that I heard from scholar Bart Ehrman. He says that the different Gospels have different stories about Jesus. In Matthew's Gospel, we are told about Jesus being whipped, about him being beaten and bruised and spat upon and given the crown of thorns and stumbling as he carried his crossbeam and needing the help of Simon the Cyrenian because he was too weak to carry the crossbeam. And when he's on the cross, he cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then gives a loud cry before dying. And this all seems to make him weak, because I guess that's the narrative that the author wanted to put forward. Because if we compare that with something like Luke, for instance, we still have the beating and the spitting and lots of, we still have the victim narrative, but not to such an extreme degree. When he's on the cross, he says, forgive them, they know not what they do. And his last words, instead of my God, why have you forsaken me, are, into thy hands I commend my spirit. It's stronger. It's not quite as strong as the Gospel of John, in which throughout the whole Gospel, God has been a very strong character. This is the Gospel where he continually keeps telling people that he's the Son of God, he's the Savior, he's the way, the life, and the truth. He is the only one. And in the end, we're not told that he's spat upon or beaten or mocked. None of that is recorded. When he carries his cross, we're not told that he needs the help from Simon the Cyrenian. He does it himself. When he's on the cross, he doesn't give out a loud cry. He says, as his last words, it is finished, and then hangs his head and gives up the ghost. This is a very strong Jesus, and so they're telling a different story. So why tell a story that Matthew did? Because he was trying to describe Jesus a certain way for his own literary points. Just because you can't think of a reason doesn't mean that there's not an alternative to it's all true. Especially when we look at the contradictory stories of the same narrative. Finally, he's got a section called The Stones Cry Out, where he introduces some archaeological evidence for the New Testament. And I like this bit because it is the only actual evidence put forward to it. It's not deductive logic. It doesn't prove that the entirety of the New Testament is reliable, but it does add some reliability to it to come up with some corroboration for the events. For instance, we don't believe that there was a worldwide census because, mainly from an argument from silence, if there was a global census and everybody had to return to their cities, it would have been an inconvenience, so much so that people would have written about it. And of course, we'd have government records talking about it, and we don't have that. And so he assumed that it probably didn't come true. It doesn't mean it necessarily didn't come true. We just don't have the evidence, and so skepticism would compel us to disbelieve it until that evidence comes forward. And he says that we found an order for a Roman census in Egypt, a local one that asked for all citizens to come back to their own homes. And so he says it's not impossible to imagine for this to be global. And it's not. We don't really doubt that such a thing could happen. We just don't think it did because the evidence isn't there. And then at one time, Pontius Pilate wasn't believed to be a real character, but then we found out that he was, and that's good. And we have evidence of something called polytarchs, rulers of the city, as described in Acts 17:6. And I don't know why anybody would ever doubt that such a thing existed, except that we didn't have the evidence, and then we found the evidence, and so now we do believe it. Great corroboration. That's fine. The last section is called A Final Word from Sir William, who is Sir William Ramsay, an archaeologist, who says Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. It's an argument from authority. It's a logical fallacy. It's saying, well, this guy who's highly respected and knows a lot about his field believes that Christianity is true, and we ought to believe it, so you should too. And that's just simply not a good enough argument. We shouldn't believe it just because somebody else does. And so that is all of this chapter. I zipped through it really fast, and this isn't even my first take. I did a longer one, which showed my utter contempt for how much he makes the exact same arguments. I think this is a wasted chapter. But anyway, we're through it. And tomorrow we'll get on to a much better chapter. Chapter 4, did the physical resurrection of Christ really happen? And I well imagine that this is going to take more than one video, because I have so many thoughts and so many good points I think to make on this one. So I hope you'll tune in tomorrow to catch the next chapter of this book. And if you like it, share, subscribe, you know the drill. Peace out.